if you need to affirm your team, also don't just say, hey, you're doing a good job. What is good? So as we affirm people, say, the way you handled that one customer, that's what people are looking for. So as we affirm, don't just say good or, hey, that was decent.
If you want to have a culture where people actually care about each other, you got to say something positive.
Oh, absolutely. Hey, good day and welcome to the Consultant and the Coach podcast. I'm here with my good friend Josh. How are you, my friend?
Great. How are you?
I'm doing well. Hey, you know what? This is the third part in a three-part series. We started with, hey, what 5 bad traits, if we continually exhibit as leaders, is a recipe for disaster. Last week was the 5 traits that's kind of a, hey, this is where we need to go to be an effective leader. Well, today is the solution. We're going to jump right to the solution of what 2 things we need to have as leaders to really help our team.
And moving from, I think, the bad traits to the good traits, right? Even recognizing the bad traits sometimes are stuff from people's past they're bringing in. And that aside, we're helping them move past that.
Yeah. And it's one of those things. And I'll start. No one has perfection.
No.
But at least it's great to know what the end goal is, and that's where we're going. So, devotion for this morning, I wanted to read Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. And this is the end of the book. And the 2 verses are, the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Now, the reason why I brought that up is I wanted to focus on, it says every deed into judgment. So everything that we do as leaders, every single thing, God already knows. And sometimes as leaders, it's like, well, I'm not going to talk about that. Well, God already knows.
Right.
And the reason why I'm bringing this up is as we look at our leadership, we need to understand, 1, God knows where we're at, but 2, we need to work on where we're not running at 100%, and we need to be honest about it. And that's where we're going today. So we've talked about the 5 things that can derail our leadership. We've talked about the solution. But the reason why I bring every deed into judgment, God already knows. And we need to own, hey, 1, he knows it, but hey, let's lay it out and say, hey, I'm really great here. I can improve here. And that's where we're going with, kind of like today's podcast. What are the ingredients to the secret sauce?
Excellent.
So let's do a quick, for someone that just jumped onto this episode, the 5 bad things that will derail our leadership is if we think we're better than others, if we're invulnerable, for example, we believe nothing can derail us, or or saying we're not going to allow anything to penetrate our force field. If we believe we're too good and perfect, so this would be perfectionism, will derail our leadership. If we're either needless or anti-dependent. And last, if we always have to be in control of everything. This is the micromanager. I'm going to hire people, but I won't actually give them authority over their work. So, what do you think about that? The 5,
Well, it's funny you say those because every now and then it makes me think of random connections, and I won't get into promoting a show or a different show, but I find it's interesting, most of the most popular TV shows, most of the personas have at least one, if not many, of those problems.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. So if you're looking for personas of these types, right, so there's sort of extreme examples. Look to your favorite TV characters, right? Because it's so many of these, it's so funny how much, I can never tell if Hollywood is telling me how to act or how not to act, but anytime I see a show, I go, that's a terrible way to live your life. Because usually one of those 5 things, if not most of them, each person has.
And they'll take it and they'll do it to the nth degree.
Oh, yeah.
And that's actually what makes it so funny, is if you take this, for example, the person who is a perfectionist, everything needs to be perfected to the nth degree.
Right.
We're like, well, I'm not that much.
Right. It makes everybody feel better about their dysfunction, I think. But
so that was the bad. Now, last week we went over the 5 traits, and this is what successful leaders do. And this is, so for example, and we'll get into, what's the secret sauce, but the 5 traits from last podcast was equality. We are all equal under God. Now, this is like what you said. We don't have, we're not saying everyone gets the same pay or everyone has the same duty, but we are all equal under God. We can't think we're better or worse than everyone else. So that's number one. Number two, shielded vulnerability. So it's one of those things, we need to be vulnerable with the people we work, base level of trust, but at the same time, you don't let everyone, you don't want to be too vulnerable. It's shielded vulnerability. Number three is we're all human and humble. You got to be humble to say, hey, what else can I learn? Mm-hmm. 4 is interdependent. We work as a team. Even with this podcast, I'm dependent on you. You're dependent on me. It's an example of interdependency. And then last is bridging the gap of moderation and spontaneity. So, you don't want to be so spontaneous where you're running around with your head cut off.
Yep.
But you also don't want to be so moderated. We're like, what does he believe? Does he ever smile? Does he? That would be a robot.
Right. Yeah.
So we need all 5 of these.
Yeah. And likewise, I would say drama and TV and culture doesn't value any of those 5 things. Like
No.
you rarely will see those in in a character that stood up as sort of an example in most modern day media, in my opinion.
But here's where TV gets it right.
Yeah.
Why do you see so much drama on TV?
What do you think?
Well, I believe it's because we like watching
We
it.
like watching it, sure. Yeah.
When we
It's
like
good to
watching
eyeballs.
it, and it's ingrained in us. We are meant to be spontaneous. Look at how God's made us. Look at how, and it's one of those.
Oh,
things.
sure. There's dimensions.
And
Yeah.
that's where I'm going with that is sometimes if we are so doggone boring, I might just say, hey, we need to build some drama into our life. Not to the point where things are crazy, but like, how can we have fun?
Yeah.
How can we have fun at work?
Yeah.
And it's one of those things, when I lead a meeting, I tell my team members, I'm like, grade my meeting. And if this is the most boring meeting in the world, you need to let me know because I need to make it more engaging for our team. So this is where, moderation and spontaneity, you need both. Mm-hmm. So let's get to the secret sauce. Here's the secret sauce. There's 2 things we need.
Just 2?
Just 2.
Great.
Yeah.
Easy.
Okay. What do you want to do first?
Just give them to me. Both of them right now.
Here are the 2. Limits and affirmation. That's it. Those 2 things is all that we need. Why? Am I being too simple?
No, I think it makes sense. I mean, putting on my dad hat, that's mostly what my kids need. So it makes sense that would translate to sort of a human nature kind of basic need, right? It's a human need.
It is a basic need, but
Yeah.
let's take it. So the answer is very simple. Limits and affirmation. So think of your team member, anyone that you've led in a consulting project of yours, any major project. Let's just kind of throw this into that. Where we want everyone is equality, shielded vulnerability, humility, interdependent, and the bridge between moderation and spontaneity. When are limits necessary?
Yeah.
So we say limits is the solution. How?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't tell you that. Recount different projects I've worked on over and over again in my career. I would say that limits in particular is important from a project structural perspective, right? So consulting and trying to build out, say, a future strategy for a company, or right now, actually, I just was on a call with a new client this morning where we were talking about the need for some organizational accountability they don't have, right?
Limits.
Yeah, limits, and also policies and procedures, so governance, right? So governance is all about limits, right? And so it's great that that's number 1 because so many times organizations miss they fall on one side or the other, too much affirmation or too many limits. This organization has no limits, right? And so trying to articulate, creating groups that help to secure alignment, expectations, education, buy-in from all the right parties, the ability to facilitate and follow up with commitments in meetings. So how do we actually create accountability and actually be able to clearly communicate when someone has said something in this meeting next week and the week after and the week after? It's going to keep coming up on the list, whatever the list looks like, that they committed to do X by this date, right? So creating structures that concisely structure those limits is really helpful for organizations. I also find in my consulting arrangements when I'm able to be most successful with a client that we have set clear limits, also known as an SOW, at the beginning, when we know what the role is.
You have the SOW, the statement of work,
That's right.
which is essentially your limits.
Yeah, exactly.
I've committed to this.
Yes, or when you're a company and you're doing a work on behalf of a client, right? SOW, same thing, gives you the boundaries in which you're going to operate. So I think the same thing applies to our leadership of teams when we know who is in charge of what, and we're able to clearly talk about that on a regular basis.
And I've thought, it's when I listen to people, one of the biggest sources of discontent in the United States today is unmet expectation. So we're talking about limits.
Yep.
And the vision that comes into my head is a football field. I just watched football this last weekend. You have a huge field. It's 100 yards long. I don't know how wide it is. It's maybe 50 yards wide or whatever it is. But there are limits. So you can run anywhere in this football field, but you can't run out of bounds. And so that's like our company. You don't have to stay within, 2 yards here or there. There's a lot of leeway, but the limits are the sidelines on each side. You go out of bounds, play's over.
Right.
That's what limits are. You can't say, I don't have any limits. I trust everyone. Hey, even the CEO, the owner, the base clerical worker, all of us have limits, and they've got to be communicated.
And when you see companies fail, many times it's because of a failure of leadership that's tied to lack of limit. Someone who became power hungry, right? Someone, a CEO who sort of got outside the scope of their responsibilities, right? Or sort of got a little bit too far in front, go down those list of bad traits. You could review those again. I mean, it's someone who got far afield from what they were supposed to do, or an internal leader who the CEO had to fire, right? Who just sort of lost the limits of where they should be operating.
And so, for example, one that is, it's not bad to be good, but one of the bad things is perfectionism. And this is, in working with really high-end professionals, what you'll see is like, well, there's nothing wrong. I just expect perfection. The problem is no one's perfect.
Yep.
So what are you going to do with that? And this is the person they keep firing everyone. Well, no one's been perfect yet. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So what do you do with that? Now, so we start with limits. The other half is affirmation.
Yep.
So why would one half be limits and the other be affirmation as the solution? This is the secret sauce to great leadership.
Well, I think you have to have both, because obviously if you only have limits and you don't have any sort of, it's similar to, in some ways, I think, the moderation and spontaneity kind of balancing, right? You have to have discipline. You have to have clear expectations of where you go, where you don't go, inbounds, out of bounds. But if you want to have a culture where people actually care about each other, you got to say something positive.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I had a really great leader, CIO, who I was helping work on a merger of 3 companies and IT groups. And I really appreciated how he had, while a very structured way he did his work and a method for his agenda writing for his team meetings, that was limits. Here's the things we're going to talk about. Here's how we keep track. At the same time, it was very wide limits in terms of giving lots of space to absorb sort of the organizational pressures that his team was under, right, which was great. And so he was able to use that as a way to then affirm them, saying, hey, good job on this. Hey, you keep doing this. Hey, good, thanks for telling me about that. Like, it was a safe place where they could bring up issues and wrestle with them. And so I think you did a really good job of balancing those, because it's possible, as long as you think about both your limits and how you're going to go out of your way to affirm the work that people are doing, even when they bring you a problem.
Yeah.
Right?
Or even if they make a mistake.
Yeah.
And so
they go outside the limits.
And one of the things that we can do is, sometimes I want my team to push so hard. Sometimes they'll make mistakes. How do we affirm them in their effort? And this is where, so you can't just have straight up limits, but you also can't have straight up affirmation where, hey, you're doing great all the time. No, you blew that. Here were your KPIs, or you missed this, and this could really, really hurt our company.
Yeah.
So it's this combination of limits on one side and affirmation on the other side. And so here's one of the things. I wrote down the goal in these 5 positive traits, and I don't want to hang too much towards perfectionism, but I was thinking, if you could hit 65% in these top 5 traits, you're nailing it. And because I was thinking, so if I say, hey, the top 5 goals are equality, shielded, vulnerability, humility, interdependence, and the combo between moderation and spontaneity, no one's going to hit all of it. But what does a healthy leader look like? If you were to tell me, hey, Erik, I'm in that 65% of the time, I'd say, hey, Josh, you're nailing it, man. Because no one, you're always going to end a little bit too spontaneous,
right,
or too
probably not me,
in
but
control. Well, that's why I will be too spontaneous.
You're too spontaneous.
But
I'll be too. What's the other one?
too moderated.
That's me. I'm too moderated, so we're good.
But
blended, we get 65%.
Blended, if we're hitting it 65% of the time, that's a sweet spot.
Yeah.
Goal is 100% perfect, but no one is that. So I'm like, if we are hitting these 65% of the time, you're getting it in a good way.
Yeah. Well, I think what the lesson here for our leaders is keep leaning in, keep working on these, keep setting for yourself limits, finding people to affirm you, provide those limits and affirmation to the people around you, and just make progress on these 5. It's not a perfectionist thing. You're not going to be all 100% on all 5.
And so, but you even just said, hey, Erik, like for example, I tend to be a little bit too moderated. I tend to be a little bit too spontaneous. I know that. We just hired at our company, we have a brand new team member today. We just hired him, and granted, I happen to know his family. And so I went and talked to him.
The wonderful thing about a small town.
It's like, oh, great. For better and worse.
Yes, it is.
But what I told... I went and told my HR company, or my HR lead this morning, I'm like, okay, here's a new team member. I know how he leans. So what we're going to actually do with this team member is we're going to actually keep his rope really, really short, because if not, he's going to get himself in trouble, because he's not highly disciplined. He's really smart. But what we're going to do is we're going to keep a lot of limits on him the first 3 months.
Sure.
Whereas I have other people, they're going to be so great at following the rules. I'm going to have to affirm them. I need you guys to put the pedal on the accelerator a little bit more. Everyone's a little bit different. So if we happen to know people on our team where they lead, we'll know how to affirm them, either by setting more limits, or actually, they're never going to break a rule because they're one of those people. We need to affirm them. Hey, well, if there were no rules, what would you actually do? How do we pull it out of them? Everyone's a little bit different. So, if we can build, these traits 65% of the time, hey, we have a winning organization.
That's great. Yeah.
So other things I thought, as we're, working on limits and affirmation, not everyone is in a very open and safe work environment. So what do you do with someone like that? So, we could say, hey, Josh, these ideas are great. It's not safe in my company. If I were to do this, I would either be fired or ridiculed, or what do you do with someone like that if they're not the head honcho?
Yeah, I think, we've talked about different issues like this with sort of unsafe environments in several previous episodes. I think one we've done, in the past on support and life teams, right, is a big one, which I think we've got written down there. So I think, thinking about who your relationships are, what is it you think you need? So I think, tracking back to the 5 bad traits and good traits, where do you lean based on just your history and your strengths and your weaknesses, and where do you need help and affirmation to move from those? And then your life team can be a key giver of that, right? You're not the only place.
Exactly.
But yeah.
And that's where I was going with that. Sometimes there's not a safe place in your organization.
Yep.
And I just, before we had this podcast, my daughter called me on FaceTime. She's like, Dad, can I vent to you real quickly? And I'm like, sure, of course.
Is this the college-bound one?
This is the one in college.
She's in college. Great.
And she's like, this happened with my roommate, and and she just went off. But it was one of those things. I didn't try to solve the problem. I just listened to her. I empathized with her. And that's it. She had something that she had to get off her back. And it probably wouldn't have been all that great if she did it to her roommate. Now, it keeps happening. She needs to. But sometimes at work, we need to have a safe place. If something's really bad, especially if let's say it's your boss, who are you going to vent to and ask for containment from? I mean, we always have our spouse if we're married, but at the same time, this is the life team. This is like, who do you have in your back pocket that you can call and just say, hey, I need to vent this, so you don't blow things up at work.
That's right.
come in very even keeled.
I can't tell you how many times I wish I would have had that early in my career, especially in early career, right? When you don't know how to handle these issues. I think I would actually say it's even more important for early careers.
Oh, absolutely, because we're young and we think everything should be perfect, and we have the solutions, and we're like, oh, crumb, it's not that way.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. At least it was for me, and I suspect if you're listening to this and you have young leaders, encourage them to get those folks they can call and vent to outside the organization, because it will help their development too.
And so, the solution being, okay, we have limits on this side, we have affirmation on this side as we have our team, and this is where I would say, have a coach or whoever is coaching you up, make sure the coach has done their work. So what I wrote down first is, make sure, everyone should have a coach, but also make sure you have a coach that's done their work. So they don't just have the answers. They've also walked the process. So think of, 25-year-old Josh, 25-year-old Erik. And, we had the answers, but there's the process of like, oh, I see why the leaders at the company struggled so much. It's not as simple as here's the answer.
Yep.
We've got to walk the process.
Well, and if you're, I would say if folks are particularly interested in this sort of construct we're talking about, one of the things I've seen work really well is when there's a coach who's actually coaching the same coach for several members of the executive team, because they can, while obviously not betraying confidence, they can help to weave together issues they're hearing and seeing across styles and cultural challenges into their coaching. I don't know what you think about that. I mean, you're a coach, I'm not, but I've seen that work well when you have the same person.
It does. And how I coach, when I coach teams, our coaching is always confidential.
Right.
So whoever I talk to, even if they're like, if I see certain things, unless it's actually breaking the law and I have to disclose, I never disclose any conversations. So even when there's syncs within the organization, what I tell the team that I'm coaching, tell me your lead. What are the broad brush strokes that you want to communicate with them? And that's actually the main issue. That's where things are. It's not about he said this exact thing, same thing, and it's this game of whack-a-mole. I'm not going to get into the details. It's the big broad brush strokes, and that's actually what we're at.
Right.
Because when I hear people complain about, I can't stand about my boss, the boss typically knows what he or she is doing. It's typically how they communicate.
Yeah.
And so it's more of a communication. That's kind of what we're getting into. Hey, Josh brought this to me, and just the way he didn't make eye contact, or the way he didn't understand that I had a hard day because my kid is sick at home, or you name it. And that's kind of what we're looking at with coaching, and what does that look like?
Yep. Great.
So, we have limits on one side, affirmation on the other side. What do you think most organizations struggle with, one or the other? Limits or affirmation?
Affirmation for sure. I think most. I mean, there's a few that are less, and it probably actually depends on the size and maturity. So I would suspect a lot of smaller organizations, it's actually limits they struggle with versus
I would agree with
large, stodgy, old organizations have lots and lots of limits built up over many, many, many years without a lot of good affirmation. So it depends a little on what your organization is.
I would agree with you on that one. I think most organizations really do struggle with affirmation. And when, here's one of those things. If you need to affirm your team, also don't just say, hey, you're doing a good job, or hey, this is great. What is good? So as we affirm people, say, you know what? The way you handled that one customer, the way you empathized with her and then was able to close the sale, that's what people are looking for. So as we affirm, don't just say good or hey, that was decent. No, dial into a specific detail about what they did, because that's going to resonate.
Well, I think the other benefit, the other opportunity for leaders is not only to get into the specific thing they did, but then tie that back to how that matters for both the mission and the goals of the company. Like you closed that sale, which contributed to our revenue goal this month, right? Like that helps actually folks know you believe in the rocks or big goals, whatever you have. That helps people know you're listening to the connections. Yeah.
Coming back to our football analogy, because here's the game and this is the score, and because I only gained 2 yards, but it was 3rd and 1 and we got a first down.
Right.
That was a big 2 yards.
Right.
People get that.
Exactly.
And so, well, good. Well, hey, this concludes our 3-part series, and basically what 5 traits is going to make your team succeed. And, the secret sauce, limits and affirmation.
Yep. Come back next week then. We're going to be shifting here to a new method, right?
Well, kind of.
Big unveiling.
Big unveiling. We're going to do, we're just going to do Lencioni's new book. I just had a brain
The
freeze.
Working Genius.
The Working Genius.
There you go.
I was thinking the
6
things.
types. It's 6 types of working
I was
genius.
going to say Lencioni's book, The 6 Things. No, it's The Working Genius. Book
Yep.
comes out next week, and we're just going to go through, just like we did an unveiling of my
Yep.
Working Genius. We're going to do the same thing with the book. You know, it'll be fun.
Yeah,
So
I think look for it. It'll drop probably a couple of days after the book comes out.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll do our best to get it out as quickly as we can, and we're going to read it as soon as we can get our hands on it and see where we go.
In the meantime, hey, if you need a consultant who's going to go the extra mile for you and your team, hey, go to theconsultantthecoach.com and look us up, and hey, reach out to us. We would love to talk to you.
Sounds good.
Good. Until next week.
Take
Thanks,
care,
guys.
everybody.